Hi everyone, my name is Zoe Landry and I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa, but much of my research is conducted at the Canadian Museum of Nature. Today, I'm going to be sharing the research that I conducted on polar bears from Nunavut during my master's degree. Polar bears are the largest of all bear species and are also the largest terrestrial carnivore in the world. They inhabit almost the entirety of the circumpolar Arctic, from Canada to Russia and everywhere in between. Despite popular belief, they are not territorial, and their range varies in size based on sea ice extent. Polar bears exhibit what is called sexual dimorphism, which means that there are visible differences between males and females. Male bears are much larger and can be up to 3 meters long and weigh up to 1,500 pounds. Females are smaller and can be up to 2.5 meters long and weigh up to 550 pounds. The diets of polar bears are largely composed of marine animals. Seals are the favorite prey of polar bears and are thought to be their main source of food, which polar bears hunt through openings in the ice. They are also known to eat whales, though polar bears mostly scavenge whales as carcasses and rarely hunt them. Sea ice is very important for polar bears. Not only do they use it to hunt seals, but they also use it to travel to find mates or dens. Unfortunately, sea ice has been decreasing each year since the mid-1950s, and sea ice loss has accelerated in recent decades as Arctic temperatures rapidly climb. This loss of sea ice has greatly affected polar bears. In some regions, where there is not enough ice, polar bears have begun to move inland to seek out alternative sources of food. They will often venture into areas inhabited by humans to scavenge garbage, which is dangerous for both humans and bears alike. If sea ice loss continues, the Arctic could be completely ice-free by the summer of 2040. This could have devastating impacts on polar bears since they would lose hunting access to marine prey for months. This led me to wonder, could polar bears adapt their diets to cope with changing Arctic conditions? Unfortunately, we can't see the future, but we can use evidence from the past to make predictions. Some of the best evidence can be obtained from specimens of historic polar bears that are stored in museum collections, such as those at the Canadian Museum of Nature. But what can old bones tell us about polar bear diets? We can use forms of chemical elements called isotopes, which are present in bones and provide a record of an animal's diet. This is because as an animal eats something, it ingests the isotopes from the food and assimilates them into its own body. In my research, I use isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. Carbon isotopes tell you what type of environment an animal was feeding in. Animals like polar bears that feed in a marine environment have very different carbon signatures than animals that feed mainly on land. Nitrogen isotopes tell you where an animal sits in the food chain. The higher the value, the higher its position. The axiom of isotope research is, you are what you eat. Isotopes allow us to make reliable predictions about an animal's diet. In this case, we can use isotopes to discover what polar bears ate in the past to understand if their diets might have been more flexible than previously thought. To conduct my research, I took samples of polar bear bones from bears that lived during the 20th century. I extracted the collagen from the bone powder to analyze it for carbon and nitrogen isotopes. The signatures from these isotopes allowed me to uncover what historic polar bears were eating throughout their lifetimes. Unsurprisingly, seals were the most frequently consumed prey by 20th century polar bears, making up more than 40% of their overall diet. Ringed seals were the preferred prey of polar bears, although they ate bearded seals too. Seals have therefore remained a very important food source for polar bears over time. Something I didn't expect was that whales were significant contributors to polar bear diets, and beluga whales made up about 23% of their overall diet. Although most polar bears were probably scavenging beluga whale carcasses, there are documented cases of polar bears successfully catching belugas to eat. Another cool finding was that historic polar bears were eating bowhead whales. Now, these whales are absolutely massive and impossible for polar bears to hunt, so they would have been exclusively scavenged. Dozens of polar bears will gather to feed on a single whale carcass, which can feed them all for several months. I also discovered what polar bears in the past weren't eating. Walruses contributed less than 10% to the overall diets of polar bears, and I can't say that I blame the bears for not eating them. Walruses are large and live in big groups, making it a dangerous task for a polar bear to try and catch one. Speaking of items that are off the menu, it turns out polar bears do not like terrestrial foods. It's highly unlikely that historic polar bears were feeding on land, since their isotope signatures were clearly aligned with the marine diet. To polar bears, foods like caribou and berries are definitely not very appetizing. Isotopes have revealed that historic polar bear diets are very similar to the diets of present-day polar bears. They were feeding mainly on marine animals, with a strong preference for seals, although they would have eaten whales as well. Unfortunately, this shows that polar bears have very restricted diets. This means that the survival of polar bears is closely linked to the persistence of sea ice. The complete loss of sea ice during the summer will have devastating impacts on polar bears, and if current trends continue, polar bears could go extinct by the end of the 21st century. This means it's very important to protect sea ice for polar bears. Meeting climate goals will help mitigate temperature increases in the Arctic, which will in turn preserve sea ice. Not only will this save the polar bears, but it will also help save many other Arctic animals that depend on sea ice for survival.